They called it an invite, but it felt more like a summons. The email landed in Elena Brooks's inbox at exactly 9:47 a.m., a cold, polished message from HR titled, "Dinner with the Donnies, Friday, 7 p.m." A smiley face at the end, like punctuation, could make the formality feel friendly. After 22 years, this was how it began. Elena didn't want to go. She already sensed the shift. Once the backbone of Stratagem Insights, Inc., a company she helped build from a rented 800-square-foot warehouse in the industrial zone of Denver into a $120 million analytics powerhouse, she now found herself on the outside looking in. The air had changed. Weekly updates to the CEO became bi-weekly, then optional. The tone in meetings morphed from collaborative to corporate jargon, like someone had replaced substance with style. Still, she went. She wore the navy blouse that always made her feel capable, paired with the pearl earrings her daughter gave her last Mother's Day. She looked in the mirror before leaving and reminded herself, "You didn't just work there, you built it." Back in 2001, Stratagem Insights was a pipe dream. Richard Hale, the founder, had ideas but no structure. Elena was his first hire. At the time, there were 3 clients, 1 finicky printer, and a shared vision scrawled on whiteboards. She did it all: contracts, client pitches, even cleaned the tiny office kitchenette. She didn't mind. It was a startup, and more importantly, it was hers in a way most jobs never were. Richard used to call her the quiet engine. When vendors threatened to bail, Elena negotiated them back. When payroll almost bounced, she crunched the numbers, dug into receivables, and made it work. She was the person you never saw in press releases, but whose fingerprints were on every success story. She still remembered the night in 2003 when Richard, bleary-eyed and sleep-deprived, handed her a single-page agreement and said, "I can't afford to pay you what you deserve, but if we make it, I want you to have a piece of this." It was 5% equity, and at the time, it felt more like a thank you card than anything with teeth. But Elena signed it, loyal, hopeful, exhausted, and tucked the paper away in a folder that would gather dust for years. That piece of paper would become her anchor. In the early days, she'd work until 2 a.m., then come in at 7. She skipped family barbecues, missed birthdays, even worked through a Denver snowstorm that shut down most of the city. Not because she had to, but because she believed in it. She believed in building something that mattered. Now, all these years later, the belief was still there. But so was the ache. Not the kind you get from a bad chair or too many hours at a desk, but the ache of watching something you poured your life into turn cold and unfamiliar. At that rooftop dinner, beneath the glittering skyline, it was clear. This wasn't just a meal. It was the opening scene of a decision already made. Richard stood beside his daughter Sloane, polished, poised, and freshly minted from a Stanford leadership course, ready to hand over the reins. Elena smiled. She nodded. She listened. But inside, something stirred. Because while everyone else in that room had forgotten what she'd done to build Stratagem Insights, Elena hadn't. And soon they'd remember, too. It was halfway through the halibut when the knife twisted. Richard folded his hands on the table, the candlelight reflecting off his silver cufflinks like a man about to offer a toast. Or a goodbye. "Elena?" he began, tone soft like he was offering condolences. "We've been doing some long-term planning?" "Of course you have," she thought. "You've been more than instrumental in getting Stratagem Insights where it is today." There it was, the setup. That little word, been, past tense. He was dressing up a dismissal in the language of legacy. "As we position the company for its next phase," Richard continued, "we feel it's time to bring in a new generation, fresh energy, new vision." Across the table, Sloane Hale smiled with her teeth. Dressed in a linen pantsuit that probably cost more than Elena's first car, She radiated the kind of curated confidence that came from boardroom boot camps and LinkedIn workshops. She just completed an executive leadership program at Stanford, a detail Richard mentioned like it should automatically erase the 22 years Elena had spent holding this company together with sheer grit. She's got some amazing ideas about modernizing the brand, moving us into blockchain, AI. Richard was beaming now, like a father proud of his daughter's first science fair win. Elena kept her expression neutral, her voice even. Impressive. What's the transition plan? Richard visibly relaxed. 6 weeks. She'll shadow you at first. We'll make the formal announcement after the quarterly call. And, of course, there's a generous package. And then Sloane leaned forward, her fork hovering midair like she was about to deliver dessert, not insult. Time to step aside, Granny, she said with a giggle. Let us take it from here. The table went silent. Even Richard's wife, Marilyn, paused mid-chew. Elena looked directly at Sloane, then back at Richard. For a moment, she said nothing. She just nodded slightly and smiled. A tight, professional smile. So this was it. Not a board meeting, not an official performance review. Just dinner, wine, and a quiet shove out the door. But while they thought they were closing a chapter, Elena knew better. She wasn't obsolete, she was overlooked. And there's a difference. One you learn when you've survived this long in the corporate trenches. You don't last 22 years without knowing when a storm's coming or how to weather it. They'd mistaken her silence for surrender, her patience for passivity. They forgot the contract Richard handed her in 2003. The dusty piece of paper granting her 5% equity when payroll couldn't cover raises. Elena hadn't sold it, hadn't traded it in for cash or recognition, but she had kept it, reviewed it, and realized years ago that it gave her more than sentimental value. It gave her power, voting rights, stakeholder leverage. And when Richard started chasing buzzwords instead of stability, she didn't argue. She watched, quietly, strategically. She learned early that in business, the loudest person in the room rarely holds the most power. It's the one who understands the rules and when to play the ace they've kept hidden. So when Elena left the rooftop that night, heels clicking against cold concrete, she wasn't defeated. She was preparing, calculating. She went home, poured a glass of Cabernet, pulled open the bottom drawer of her home office, and stared at the shareholder agreement. They had no idea what they'd just awoken. Elena didn't storm into the office Monday morning. She strolled in, calm, collected, and more composed than anyone who'd just been gently shoved toward the exit had any right to be. She smiled at reception, took her usual black coffee from the machine that still hissed like a 1970s train engine, and headed to her office like nothing had changed. Because for now, nothing had. Not on paper, anyway. The announcement hadn't been made. There were no all-staff emails, just whispers, confusion, and one very smug 28-year-old shadowing her like a perfume ad with Wi-Fi. Sloane had shown up that morning early, of course, with her monogram tote, her branded reusable coffee cup, and a smile just a few watts too bright. "Excited to learn from you," she chirped. Elena returned the smile. "Sure you are." She knew what Sloane was really doing, looking for a weakness, a shortcut, trying to absorb 22 years of systems, relationships, and operational nuance in 6 weeks. The girl might have had a Stanford certificate, but she didn't know the difference between back-end continuity and buzzword compliance. And that was going to be a problem. For Sloane, Elena spent the rest of the morning quietly downloading copies of stock agreements, board voting records, and executive compensation data. Her access hadn't been cut yet. Oversight or arrogance, she couldn't tell. Either way, she wasn't going to waste it. By lunchtime, she had 2 phone calls scheduled, one with Diana Keller an old friend turned high-powered IP attorney, and one with the executive assistant who still thought Elena walked on water. "I'd like a private meeting with Richard," she said. The assistant blinked. Of course, I'll check his calendar." That afternoon, she pulled out the dusty gray file cabinet beneath her window, the one no one touched. Inside were the real blueprints of Stratagem Insights, the original system architecture sketches, handwritten notes from client pitches, and a cocktail napkin with the first dashboard UI prototype drawn in Sharpie. Buried beneath it all was a yellowed folder marked Proprietary Tools, Legacy Systems. Inside, a signed NDA from Richard dated 2005, confirming that several core tools were adapted from software Elena had created in her private consulting days. She had built it, licensed it, then gifted it to Stratagem Insights under the assumption of shared loyalty and long-term stewardship. They wanted a clean transition. She had receipts. When she met with Diana the next morning at a quiet bistro 2 blocks from the office, the attorney barely got through her almond croissant before flipping through the documents and nodding. "Elena," she said, eyes glinting, "you don't just have leverage, you own part of their backbone." "Can I protect it?" Elena asked. "You can lock it down so tight they'll need your blessing just to breathe near it." Elena exhaled. 2 decades of grit and loyalty, now fully armed with paper, precedent, and patience. By midweek, the whispers in the office had shifted. Why is Elena still here? Why hasn't Sloan taken over yet? Why does she look so calm? Noah Vega, her long-trusted data engineer, passed her in the hallway and handed her a USB discreetly. "This is your patchwork," he said quietly. "Stuff Sloan doesn't even know exists. Thought you might want a backup." Elena nodded. "Thanks, I might." Because while Sloan was staging photo shoots with PR and ordering Brand Vision slideshows, Elena was doing what she'd always done, setting the table quietly, thoroughly, strategically. And this time, she wasn't saving the company. She was saving herself from it. By the following Monday, Sloan had moved into Elena's office, not officially, no title change, no formal announcement, but her designer handbag now occupied the top drawer, and her nameplate was discreetly leaning against the bookshelf like it had always belonged there. She walked in early, toting artisanal coffee and a carefully curated air of importance. "Just want to observe how you run things," she said sweetly, propping herself in the guest chair like she was doing Elena a favor. Elena gave her a nod, unbothered. Observation is good. Listening helps too. But Sloan wasn't listening. She was preparing to replace. Her questions were shallow, rehearsed, dripping in buzzwords. "Why do we manually approve vendor invoices?" she asked, skimming a report. "To catch errors before they become lawsuits," Elena replied. "What about automation?" "Automation doesn't check for human greed. I do." Sloan blinked, smiled, and scribbled something in a notebook she'd barely opened since day one. It was clear. She didn't understand how the company ran. She only understood how it looked on paper. By Wednesday, she'd scheduled her first strategy session. The invite went out to every department head, except Elena. Noah Vega, always loyal, quietly forwarded it. Subject line, Vision 2.0, Stratagem Insights, Future begins now. Elena clicked open the agenda and let out a soft laugh. New branding initiative, outsourcing back-end support, consolidating operations, hiring freeze. It was a greatest hits playlist of every bad idea a consultant ever pitched to a boardroom trying to look cutting edge. She closed the tab and leaned back in her chair. She didn't need to crash Sloan's party. Sloan was about to crash it herself. By the end of the week, the consequences started surfacing. First, the vendor migration. Sloan had promised it would reduce costs by 15%, But the new provider had no compatibility with Stratagem Insights' legacy architecture, most of which Elena had custom built. Integration failed within 48 hours. Support tickets spiked. Clients called. Richard didn't respond. Then came the branding disaster. Sloane's new marketing campaign, Intelligence Redefined, was sleek, bold, and completely unoriginal. Within a day, legal flagged it for infringement. A smaller AI firm already held the trademark, and Elena knew the founder. She may or may not have tipped them off. By Tuesday, the crown jewel of Sloane's innovation push, the predictive analytics model, was live tested. It failed catastrophically. The system, built without understanding the diversity of Stratagem Insights' data sources, spit out flawed reports and flagged multiple accounts as frauds, including one of their oldest clients. Elena hadn't sabotaged a thing. She just hadn't saved them. That same afternoon, Sloane stood in front of the leadership team, pacing like a TED Talk speaker trapped in a malfunctioning slideshow. "We are in a period of necessary disruption," she declared. "Disruption leads to growth." Elena raised an eyebrow from the back of the room. "Disruption works when you've got a parachute. Right now, you're cutting every safety net we've got." Sloane forced a smile. "Thank you for your feedback, Elena." Richard didn't speak at all. He looked like a man trying to disappear into the upholstery. Later, Vanessa caught Elena by the break room. "3 of our legacy clients called today," she said, eyes wide. "They're nervous. One's threatening to walk." "Let me guess," Elena replied, sipping her lukewarm coffee. "Sloane hasn't responded." "Not even once. She thinks they'll wait." They won't. Elena went home that night, opened her laptop, and typed a simple 2-sentence email to Daniel Renner, the CEO of Technova, the very company once interested in acquiring Stratagem Insights. Subject: follow-up from our lunch. "If your board is serious, now is the time to move." She hit send. Let the next chapter begin. By Thursday morning, the anxiety had reached the top floor. The executive suite, once humming with ego and overconfidence, now echoed with closed-door meetings and muted phone calls. Sloane's initiatives hadn't just failed. They'd exposed cracks in the company's foundation that the board could no longer ignore. Elena didn't need to say a word. She simply kept showing up, composed, focused, and utterly unbothered. That morning, Richard appeared at her doorway. He hadn't stepped foot in her office in months. "Can we talk?" he asked, voice lower than usual, like he already knew he was late to the conversation. Elena set her coffee down. "Of course." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I want to make sure the transition is smooth," he began, slipping back into that corporate PR tone. "It's not a transition," Elena replied flatly. "It's a demolition." Richard stiffened. "Sloane's getting a lot of visibility." "Visibility isn't knowledge," she interrupted. "You invited me to dinner to get me out quietly. But now you're realizing I wasn't just part of the company. I was the company he tried to defend it. Something about generational shifts in storytelling." But Elena didn't flinch. "You handed your daughter a multi-million-dollar company and didn't think to ask if she could read the blueprint." Richard looked defeated. That soft, polite confidence he once wore like armor now looked more like regret. "I know about the Series C dilution," Elena added. "You're prepping for acquisition. Technova's circling." He blinked. "How do you know that?" Elena gave a small, knowing smile. "I've been here long enough to read the wind." He didn't deny it. "The board wanted a fresh narrative." "A narrative that didn't include me?" she finished. Richard sighed. "We're offering you a generous exit. You've earned it." "I don't want a payout," she said. "I want what's mine. Recognition. A seat at the table I built." And she left. Back in her office, she fired off a series of emails, methodical, precise, and targeted. one to her attorney, Diana, requesting provisional patents for every architecture improvement she'd developed since 2005, one to the board referencing her 5% equity and a clause buried deep in the original shareholder agreement requiring unanimous consent for structural leadership changes impacting key stakeholders, and one to Daniel Renair. Simple, measured, strategic. Later that evening, she met Vanessa and Noah Vega at a quiet diner on the edge of town. They slid into the vinyl booth like soldiers reporting to their commanding officer. "What's this?" Vanessa asked as Elena handed her a manila envelope. "Proof," Elena said calmly, "that what we've built isn't just operational, it's intellectual property, and it's traceable to us." Noah Vega flipped through his. "You're going to sue them?" "Not unless they make me," she said. "But if they think they can burn it all down and rebuild with press releases and Pinterest slides, they're mistaken." Vanessa leaned in. "Sloane's already planning a second round of cuts. I've seen the early drafts of the press release. It's all streamlining and innovation, but it's gutting the core." "Because they're packaging the company for sale," Elena replied, "stripping it down to shiny parts for Technova." Noah Vega's jaw tightened. "Are you going to stop it?" "No," Elena said, her tone calm but resolute. "I'm going to shape it." And with that, the real transition began, not one of power, but of purpose. Over the next 3 days, Elena moved like a ghost in the machine. Quiet, composed, but unmistakably present. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't demand authority. She simply acted like the person in charge, because she was. By Thursday, the boardroom was packed, not just with people, but with tension. It was the kind of thick, static-charged air that clings to your skin before a thunderstorm. Every seat at the long walnut table was taken. The board of directors, interim leadership, department heads, even Richard sat at the far end, eyes weary, posture sunken. Sloane perched beside him, flipping nervously through a leather-bound notebook she'd barely written in since this began. And across from them, confident, poised, and unbothered, sat Elena Brooks. Technova's CEO, Daniel Renair, was also in the room now. His presence wasn't ceremonial. He was here to make a decision, whether Stratagem Insights would be bought or buried. The meeting began with Celeste, the board chairwoman, standing at the head of the table. She was always composed, but today her voice carried more weight than usual. "Before we begin," she said evenly, "we need to address the elephant in the room." She gestured toward Elena. "Elena Brooks has brought forth documentation, both legal and technical, that highlights significant oversights during our transition assessment." Heads turned. Richard's expression turned to stone. Sloane stiffened, clutching her pen like it might save her. Celeste continued. "As per the original shareholder agreement signed in 2003, any restructuring of executive function that affects stakeholders holding more than 3% equity requires unanimous board consent." She paused. "Elena holds 5%. Silence fell. Then Celeste turned. "Elena, would you like to speak?" Elena stood slowly, smoothing the front of her navy blazer. She wasn't dramatic. She didn't grandstand. She simply owned the space like she'd always belonged in it. "I didn't come here to burn anything down," she began. "I came here to remind this company what it was built on." She locked eyes with no one and everyone at once. "For over 2 decades, I gave everything I had to Stratagem Insights, and somewhere along the way, that was treated as a liability. I was treated as disposable, because I didn't fit the image of what someone thought leadership should look like." Sloane flinched. "I don't want a title. I don't need a throne, but I will not stand by and watch something I helped build be gutted for optics. Innovation is nothing without foundation." And the truth is, the foundation was cracking before Sloan ever picked up a dry erase marker. Across the table, Daniel Renner cleared his throat. "We've been watching closely," he said, "and it's become clear. The systems that give Stratagem Insights its value aren't plug and play. 3 major clients have raised concerns. 2 are considering pulling contracts. And the talent responsible for those systems?" He looked at Elena. "They aren't behind your new leadership." Then he turned to the board. "Our offer still stands, but it's contingent on stability. If the current transition plan remains, we will withdraw." Translation: Sloan had to go. Richard started to speak, but Celeste raised a hand. "We'll take a 10-minute recess." As everyone filed out, Elena remained seated. So did Sloan. They sat in silence until Sloan finally spoke, voice barely a whisper. I didn't mean to destroy anything." Elena turned to her, steady. "You wanted to prove something. I get that. But you came in swinging, not knowing what you were swinging at. You treated people like problems, and you treated me like a ghost." Sloane's eyes shimmered. "What happens now?" Elena's tone softened, just slightly. "That's not up to me anymore." 10 minutes later, the room reconvened. Celeste stood like a judge delivering a verdict. Effective immediately, Sloan Hale is relieved of all transition leadership duties. Sloan's face crumbled. Richard Hale will remain in an advisory role through the acquisition period. She turned to Elena. "Elena Brooks will lead the transitional advisory team and report directly to the board and our prospective partners at Technova." No claps, no fanfare, just a heavy, inevitable silence. Elena didn't smile. She nodded, then she sat back down. The storm had passed, but the rebuilding was just beginning. Elena didn't move back into her old office. She could have. The board offered it to her within the week, complete with new furniture and a nameplate polished to a corporate shine. But she declined. That office didn't feel like hers anymore. Not after what it had been turned into. Not after what it had survived. Instead, she worked from home, a modest setup in her lakefront bungalow just north of Boulder. 2 monitors, a docking station, and a ceramic mug that said "Still the Boss" in faded script. Twice a week, she'd kick off her shoes and step barefoot onto the back deck, watching the sunrise reflect off the water while her client dashboards loaded, the same system she had built, humming quietly in the background. The chaos had passed, but Elena wasn't here for calm. She was here for clarity. The acquisition by Technova went through smoothly, thanks in no small part to Elena's leadership during the transition. She handpicked the new leadership team not based on resumes or flash, but on loyalty, competence, and integrity. Vanessa was promoted to Director of Operations. Noah Vega became Head of Engineering. Half the staff now reported to people Elena had mentored over the years. The other half slowly realized they were finally working under someone who understood how the place really functioned. Richard, to his credit, faded gracefully. He sent a brief farewell message, shook Elena's hand in the lobby, and didn't try to rewrite history on his way out. Sloan left without fanfare. No emails, no parting words. Just an empty notebook and a lesson she'd carry for years if she was smart enough to absorb it. Elena didn't gloat. She didn't do interviews or post long LinkedIn reflections. She didn't have to. Her work spoke louder than any victory speech ever could. One evening, as the trees turned golden and the lake mirrored the soft blush of a Colorado sunset, Elena opened her inbox and found a message from Celeste, the board chairwoman. Subject: Legacy. The message was brief. What you did, how you did it, wasn't just remarkable. It was a master class. You didn't demand recognition. You earned it. And in doing so, you reminded all of us what real leadership looks like. Elena read it twice. Then she closed her laptop and let out a slow breath she didn't realize she'd been holding for 22 years. This wasn't about revenge. It never had been. It wasn't about holding on to the past or punishing those who underestimated her. It was about value, about refusing to be erased, about showing that quiet doesn't mean weak, that experience doesn't mean outdated, and that loyalty, when honored, can build empires. She had no desire to be CEO. Titles were for email signatures and name badges. What Elena had now was control. Not over people, but over her time, her voice, and the legacy she had fought so hard to preserve. Some mornings, she still woke up early, mind racing with ideas. She'd sketch out improvements to old frameworks, jot down new concepts on a notepad she kept by the coffee machine. Not because anyone asked her to, but because she still loved it. The work, not the spotlight. And that was the truth of it. She never needed the stage, just the stability underneath it. In the end, Elena Brooks didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard, and the next time someone called her old school, she'd simply smile and sip her coffee, because that's exactly what saved the company. In life and business, being quiet doesn't mean being powerless. Elena Brooks's journey reminds us that experience, dedication, and integrity are often undervalued in a world chasing shiny trends and fast fixes. For over 2 decades, she built a company brick by brick, sacrificing weekends, weathering storms, and holding the foundation steady while others got the spotlight. When younger voices dismissed her as outdated, she didn't fight with noise. She responded with strategy, grace, and unwavering clarity. Her story teaches a vital lesson. True leadership isn't always loud. It's not about titles or LinkedIn accolades. It's about knowing your worth, protecting what you've built, and refusing to be quietly erased. Especially for those in midlife who've spent decades shaping their careers, Elena's story is a call to stand firm. To know that value isn't measured in trends, but in legacy. In a culture that often overlooks wisdom in favor of novelty, Elena's triumph is a quiet revolution. She didn't burn bridges, she laid new foundations. Because sometimes the most powerful move isn't taking the stage, it's owning the ground beneath it.